The morning sun had barely risen when the tow truck rattled down the quiet street with menace. Daniel Reyes stepped onto his own lawn and froze at what he saw unfolding before him. His truck was being hoisted onto a flatbed trailer. Margaret Whitfield stood nearby with a clipboard, smiling like she had won some private war. Daniel felt his heart pound as confusion turned quickly into a burning, helpless kind of anger. He had served 2 tours overseas and never imagined losing a battle on his own driveway. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Belief and exhaustion. Margaret raised her chin and said his truck violated the HOA aesthetic parking guidelines clearly. Daniel glanced at his truck. Clean and properly registered, sitting exactly where it always sat. His 7-year-old son Mateo ran outside, eyes wide and tightly. "Daddy, truck away?" the boy asked in a small, frightened voice. Daniel knelt down and promised everything would be fine, though his own voice barely believed it. Neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk, phones raised, capturing every painful second of the ordeal. Mrs. had been targeting newer families since the day she took over. Daniel remembered Margaret's first visit, smiling sweetly while listing endless rules about flags and driveways. She had complained about his veteran decal, calling it visually inappropriate for the neighborhood association standards. He had laughed it off then, never imagining she would escalate into outright harassment and theft. The tow truck driver hesitated, sensing something deeply wrong with the entire blatant situation unfolding. Margaret snapped at him, insisting the paperwork was already filed and everything was completely legal. Daniel pulled out his phone and began recording, his hands shaking with controlled, simmering fury. "This is private property," he said firmly and calm. Margaret waved her clipboard dismissively, claiming HOA authority extended over all visible parking arrangements citywide. Daniel's neighbor stepped forward and demanded Margaret produce real documentation. Margaret's smile faltered slightly, though she quickly masked it with practiced, condescending authority again. The flatbed truck rumbled to life, lifting Daniel's vehicle higher while metal chains clinked ominously. Daniel felt his chest tighten, watching years of hard work disappear behind a stranger's cruelty. He thought of his late father, who always said justice eventually finds those who abuse power. Mateo began to cry softly, overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding their once peaceful morning routine. Daniel scooped his son into his arms, whispering reassurances he desperately needed to believe himself. Around them, drawn by the commotion and the tow truck's grinding engine, Margaret straightened her blouse, clearly enjoying the spectacle she had so carefully orchestrated herself. Daniel turned toward her, eyes burning with a quiet, unshakable resolve forming inside him. "You will regret this," he said softly, though his voice carried unmistakable, controlled determination. Margaret rolled her eyes, confident her position protected her from any real consequence whatsoever. She had no idea that her actions today would soon unravel everything she controlled. The tow truck pulled away slowly, leaving an empty space where Daniel's truck once stood. Daniel stood motionless, watching the vehicle disappear, his mind racing through every possible legal option. Ruth placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, promising to help however she possibly could. Other neighbors murmured support, finally willing to speak against Margaret's years of quiet, cruel control. Daniel realized this moment had become bigger than just his truck or his own family. It had become a fight against unchecked power hiding behind harmless community rules and signatures. He looked down at Mateo, still trembling, and made a silent vow to protect him. This was not over. Not by a long. Daniel told himself firmly. Daniel spent the rest of that morning calling every number listed on his HOA contract. Each call led to confusing automated menus designed to discourage frustrated, persistent homeowners like himself. Finally, a representative confirmed something Daniel already suspected deep in his gut. There was no official violation filed against his truck in the HOA's actual records system. Margaret had fabricated the entire paperwork trail, using her position to authorize an illegal tow. Daniel's hands trembled. Not from fear now, but from a fierce, focused sense of purpose. He gathered the recording from that morning and began documenting every detail he could remember. Ruth arrived at his door holding a folder thick with complaints from other frustrated homeowners. Apparently, several families, especially those who seemed different from her own. A young immigrant couple had been fined for hanging laundry, deemed culturally inappropriate by Margaret. An elderly disabled man was cited for his wheelchair ramp violating uniform driveway aesthetic standards. Daniel realized Margaret's reign had thrived because no one ever organized against her before now. He decided enough was enough, and he would not let his son grow up afraid. That afternoon, law to retrieve his unlawfully towed truck immediately. The attendant explained the tow was authorized under a residential complaint, though paperwork seemed strangely incomplete. Daniel paid the outrageous fee, seething quietly while documenting every receipt and conversation along the way. Driving home, house, complete with manicured lawns and judgmental garden gnomes. He noticed she had no veteran decals, no military service, only endless self-appointed authority. That evening, specializing in HOA abuse and unlawful property seizure cases. The lawyer listened carefully, then said this case had clear, prosecutable theft and fraud potential. Daniel felt a flicker of hope ignite inside him for the first time that day. Meanwhile, in HOA meeting, oblivious to the storm gathering against her, she bragged to fellow board members about enforcing standards no one else dared to challenge. Unbeknownst to her, entire self-congratulatory speech on her phone. Other neighbors began sharing their own stories online, tagging local news outlets and community groups. The video of Daniel's truck being towed spread quickly across neighborhood social media pages overnight. Comments flooded in, expressing outrage over a decorated veteran being targeted by petty HOA cruelty. Margaret's phone buzzed constantly, though she dismissed it as jealous gossip from disgruntled homeowners. Daniel met with his lawyer again, presenting documentation, recordings, numbers. The lawyer confirmed Margaret had exceeded her authority, violating both HOA bylaws and state property laws. He explained towing a vehicle without proper authorization legally qualified as grand theft auto. Daniel felt a surge of vindication mixed with disbelief at how far this had escalated. He thought of Mateo's frightened eyes and knew this fight mattered far beyond himself alone. The next morning, outside the neighborhood, Drawn by the viral story. Reporters interviewed Ruth, the immigrant couple, and the disabled veteran neighbor about Margaret's pattern of abuse. Margaret refused to comment, retreating behind closed blinds as reporters gathered outside her pristine home. Daniel watched the news segment air that evening, his lawyer's words echoing through his mind. "This is no longer just about your truck," the lawyer reminded him over the phone. "This is about exposing systemic abuse hiding behind community rules and unchecked HOA authority." Daniel nodded silently, staring at Mateo sleeping peacefully, unaware of the battle being fought. Tomorrow. Ensuring Margaret finally faced consequences for her actions. For the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself a small, determined. The following morning, with his lawyer beside him, he filed a formal report detailing the unauthorized tow and fabricated HOA violation paperwork involved. Detectives reviewed his video evidence, witness statements, and documentation from multiple affected neighborhood families. Within days, a pattern of fraud, harassment, Margaret was formally charged with theft, fraud, private property. News cameras captured the moment two officers arrived at her manicured front doorstep. Neighbors watched silently from their porches as Margaret was led toward a waiting patrol car. Her face now reflected pure shock and disbelief at consequences. Daniel stood across the street, holding Mateo's hand, watching justice unfold before their eyes. Mateo looked up and asked if the scary lady would stop towing people's cars now. Daniel knelt down and told him yes. Bullies eventually face consequences for their actions. The HOA board immediately removed Margaret from her position permanently. They issued a public apology to every family she had harassed during her tenure. The immigrant couple received compensation, and the disabled veterans ramp was finally approved without dispute. Daniel's truck was returned with all fees refunded and an official written apology attached. Local news covered the story extensively, calling it a victory against unchecked community power abuse. Viewers across the country expressed outrage and relief watching Margaret's downfall unfold publicly online. Margaret eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial, accepting probation and community service hours. She was permanently banned from holding any HOA leadership position anywhere in the state. Her once pristine reputation crumbled as neighbors who once feared her now spoke freely. Daniel watched her walk away from the courthouse, stripped of authority and public respect entirely. He felt no satisfaction in her suffering, only relief that justice had finally prevailed. That evening, watching Mateo play happily in their own yard, Ruth joined him, grateful the neighborhood finally felt safe and united again. Other neighbors stopped by, thanking Daniel for having the courage to stand up first. Daniel realized one person's refusal to stay silent had sparked change for an entire community. He looked at his truck, parked proudly on his own lawn, exactly where it belonged. Mateo ran over and hugged his father tightly. Finally free from fear and confusion, Daniel hugged him back, whispering that standing up for what's right always matters most. The neighborhood slowly transformed, electing fair, every resident equally. Daniel often shared his story, encouraging others never to tolerate unchecked abuse of power. He reminded them that justice, though slow, exploit their authority. Margaret's downfall became a quiet legend, a warning against cruelty disguised as community order. Daniel's victory was not just legal, but deeply personal, restoring dignity to his family. As the sun set that evening, peace finally returned to the once troubled neighborhood. Daniel knew their fight had changed something far greater than just one parking dispute. It had proven that courage, truth, even entrenched, unchecked power. And in that quiet, justice finally felt complete and truly deserved.